November 14th, 1955, 2:17 a.m., Obninsk, Soviet Union. The temperature inside Laboratory Building 3 reads -4 degrees Celsius, but Nikolai Antonovich Dolezhal feels nothing. His wool overcoat, heavy with moisture from the pre-dawn fog, hangs on a steel hook beside the door. He wears the same gray suit he wore yesterday, the same scuffed leather shoes. His fingers, stained yellow from decades of chain smoking, tremble as he holds a technical drawing up to the inadequate light of a single bulb. Outside, the snow has stopped. Inside, something is terribly wrong. The reactor vessel, designated AM-1, the first of its kind anywhere on Earth, has been operational for 16 months. It generates 5 megawatts of electricity, a symbolic gesture more than a practical one, feeding power to the small town that houses the scientists and their families. But what Dolezhal sees in the radiation readings before him suggests something impossible. The neutron flux density in the core's peripheral channels is climbing. Not dramatically, not even alarmingly by most standards, but climbing nonetheless in a pattern that shouldn't exist. He hears footsteps in the corridor, heavy boots on concrete. Too many men moving too quickly for this hour. Dolezhal folds the paper once, then again, and slides it into his jacket pocket. When the door opens, he recognizes the uniform immediately. Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the bureaucratic euphemism for the Soviet nuclear weapons program. The officer's face is young, perhaps 30, with the kind of ideological certainty that makes Dolezhal's stomach clench. "Comrade Dolezhal," the officer says, not quite a question. "You are required at Kurchatov Street. Immediately." "Required by whom?" "That will be explained during transport." Dolezhal glances at his desk. Papers everywhere. Calculations. Blueprints for a reactor design that officially doesn't exist, that he's been told repeatedly to abandon, that contradicts every principle established by the Americans at Oak Ridge and every directive issued by Moscow. A design the party called thermodynamically unsound and ideologically suspect, because it relied on pressurized water instead of the graphite moderated approach that built the first Soviet bomb. He reaches for his overcoat. As his fingers close on the damp wool, he understands with perfect clarity that his life's work, the thing he's been building in secret, in defiance of orders, in collaboration with men who could be shot for treason, is about to be exposed, or possibly worse, vindicated. "One moment," Dolezhal says. He crosses to the window. Through the frosted glass, he can see the silhouette of the reactor building against the pre-dawn sky. Its cooling tower releases steam that glows faintly in the distant lights of Obninsk. Something about that image, the vapor rising into frozen air, the heat escaping into cold, the impossible made visible, stays with him as he follows the officer into the waiting car. He doesn't know it yet, but within 18 months his forbidden design will be replicated 47 times across the Soviet Union. Within 2 decades it will power half the country. And the decision about to be made in the next 6 hours will kill at least one man, save the career of a future general secretary, and fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Cold War's technological competition in ways that won't become clear until classified American documents surface in 1991. In 1954, the global nuclear power race exists in a state of barely concealed panic. The Americans have just connected their first civilian reactor to the electrical grid, a small experimental facility in Shippingport, Pennsylvania, still under construction but already the subject of breathless press coverage. The British have Calder Hall under development. The French are pouring money into graphite gas designs. And the Soviet Union, despite being the second nation to detonate an atomic bomb and the first to test a deliverable hydrogen weapon, finds itself in an impossible position. The official story, as told in Pravda and repeated in every technical institute from Moscow to Vladivostok, is one of Soviet scientific supremacy. Comrade Stalin himself, in his final years, declared that Soviet nuclear technology would illuminate the path to communism. The Academy of Sciences publishes optimistic reports about experimental reactors. Igor Kurchatov, the brilliant physicist who led the Soviet bomb program, receives the Order of Lenin and assurances that resources are unlimited. The truth, contained in classified memos circulating among the upper echelons of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, is considerably darker. Soviet reactor technology is derivative. The designs that successfully produce plutonium for weapons, massive graphite-moderated, water-cooled structures based on captured German research and intelligence gathered from the Manhattan Project, are fundamentally unsuitable for power generation. They're too large, too inefficient, too difficult to control precisely enough for civilian applications. The Americans, meanwhile, are developing pressurized water reactors, compact designs using enriched uranium that can be scaled up or down, that can power submarines or cities with equal facility. This technological gap represents more than wounded pride. In 1955, the Soviet electrical grid is desperately inadequate. Industrial production targets, already impossible, require power that doesn't exist. Rural electrification, promised by Lenin himself decades earlier, remains a cruel fantasy for millions. The coal supplies that might bridge this gap are located thousands of miles from major population centers, and the transportation infrastructure to move it doesn't exist. Nuclear power isn't a prestige project, it's a survival imperative. Into this crisis steps Nikolai Dolezhal, a man whose background makes him simultaneously indispensable and suspect. Born in 1899, trained as a mechanical engineer before the revolution, he spent the 1930s designing industrial boilers and heat exchangers while carefully avoiding the attention of the NKVD. His colleagues disappeared. His friends were arrested. Dolezhal survived by being competent, quiet, and ideologically invisible. When the war came, he designed steam generators for power plants. When the atomic bomb program demanded engineers who understood high-pressure systems, his name appeared on a list. By 1954, Dolezhal leads a design bureau called NICIET, the Scientific Research and Design Institute of Energy Technology, a bureaucratic designation that deliberately obscures its actual function. His team, operating from facilities in Moscow and Obninsk, is tasked with developing civilian reactor designs that can be rapidly deployed across the USSR. The pressure is extraordinary. Kurchatov wants results. The ministry wants production. The party wants propaganda victories. Dolezhal proposes something dangerous, a pressurized water reactor, VVER in Russian nomenclature, using concepts that closely parallel American designs. The resemblance is not coincidental. Soviet intelligence has provided technical details from Westinghouse and General Electric through sources that remain classified even today. But Dolezhal's design incorporates crucial modifications, different fuel geometry, alternative control mechanisms, unique cooling configurations that address specific Soviet constraints. The USSR lacks the industrial capacity to manufacture the precision components American designs require. Soviet materials science lags years behind. Dolezhal's reactor must work with cruder fuel, less sophisticated metallurgy, and operators who may have received only months of training. The technical community divides immediately. Anatoly Alexandrov, a powerful physicist with Stalin's ear, advocates for graphite-moderated designs based on proven weapons production reactors. These are Soviet designs, he argues, not American copies. They represent ideologically pure science, not bourgeois mimicry. His position has support from military officials who distrust anything that resembles Western technology, from party ideologues who see pressurized water reactors as capitulation, and from senior scientists whose careers are built on graphite reactor expertise. Dolezhal finds himself defending his design in increasingly hostile meetings. Transcripts from a December 1954 session at the Academy of Sciences, declassified in 1993, record Alexandrov asking, "Why should Soviet science follow American mistakes? Why should we build reactors that require enriched uranium we can barely produce, that demand materials we cannot reliably fabricate, that copy the capitalist approach to energy production?" Dolezhal's response is preserved in the same transcript. Because they work, because they can be made small enough to mass produce, because we are 5 years behind and we don't have time for ideological purity. The room erupts, the transcript notes extended disorder before the chairman restores control. But Dolezhal has one critical advantage, the AM-1 reactor at Obninsk. This experimental facility, operational since June 1954, is the world's first nuclear power plant connected to an electrical grid. It predates Shippingport by several years, a genuine Soviet first that generates enormous propaganda value. And it uses Dolezhal's pressurized water design. The reactor is small, only 5 megawatts, barely enough to power the research facility itself. But it works. It works reliably, with better fuel efficiency than predicted, with control characteristics superior to the graphite designs. It works, and everyone in the Soviet nuclear establishment knows it. Still, one successful prototype doesn't constitute proof. The ministry demands larger designs, 10 megawatts, 50 megawatts, eventually hundreds of megawatts. Scaling up introduces new problems. Pressure vessels must be larger than anything Soviet industry has ever manufactured. Cooling systems require pumps that don't exist. Control rod mechanisms must respond faster than current technology allows. And every component must be replicated dozens of times, because building reactors individually, custom engineering each one, defeats the entire purpose. This is the landscape in November 1955 when Dolezhal's calculations begin showing anomalous neutron behavior in the AM-1 core, when unexplained readings suggest something fundamentally wrong with his design's scaling mathematics, when a car arrives at 2:17 a.m. to take him to a meeting that will decide everything. The conference room at Kurchatov Street holds 17 men. Dolezhal recognizes most of them. Senior scientists from the atomic program, ministry officials whose exact responsibilities remain deliberately vague, 2 generals whose uniforms carry no unit designations. Alexandrov sits at the far end of the table, smoking, watching. At the head sits Vyacheslav Malyshev, Minister of Medium Machine Building, the man who controls every nuclear facility in the Soviet Union. Malyshev doesn't waste time. The Novovoronezh reactor, he says, referring to the first large-scale commercial nuclear plant under construction 200 miles south of Moscow. Your design. When will it achieve criticality? Dolezal knows this is not the real question. The vessel is complete. We're installing control systems. Perhaps 18 months. Perhaps 24 months. Malyshev slides a folder across the table. This is from our friends in America. The euphemism is transparent. KGB intelligence, technical documents obtained through espionage. Westinghouse has encountered serious problems with their pressurized water design, fuel cladding failures, unexpected corrosion. They've suspended construction on 3 planned reactors. The room is silent. Everyone understands the implication. If American designs are failing, Soviet copies of those designs will fare worse. Soviet metallurgy is inferior. Soviet quality control is inconsistent. If Westinghouse can't make pressurized water reactors work reliably, what chance does Nikit have? Alexandrov speaks for the first time. We should proceed with graphite-moderated designs, the RBMK configuration, the Russian acronym for a graphite-moderated water-cooled reactor, can be scaled to 1,000 megawatts. It uses unenriched uranium. It can be refueled while operating. It's a Soviet design, not a copy. Dolezal feels the familiar tightness in his chest. The RBMK design is dangerous. He studied the calculations. The positive void coefficient, the tendency for reactivity to increase if cooling water boils away, creates inherent instability. Western designs avoid this through negative feedback mechanisms built into the core geometry. RBMK reactors rely on operator vigilance and automated systems to prevent runaway reactions. In theory, this works. In practice, with Soviet construction quality and operator training, it's a catastrophe waiting to happen. But he can't say this. Not here. Not to men who see criticism of Soviet engineering as ideological betrayal. Instead, he opens his briefcase and removes the papers he folded hours earlier in his laboratory. The neutron flux readings from AM1, Dolezal says, show unexpected behavior in the peripheral fuel channels. At first, I thought this indicated a flaw in the design. He distributes copies. The men glance down, seeing columns of numbers that mean nothing without context. But after reviewing similar data from the American Naval Reactors program, he doesn't mention how Nikki had obtained this data. I understand what's actually happening. He stands, crosses to a blackboard, begins drawing. Pressurized water reactors have a natural safety feature that graphite designs lack. As the water temperature increases, its density decreases. Lower density means fewer hydrogen atoms to moderate neutrons. Fewer moderated neutrons means lower reactivity. The reactor automatically throttles itself back. It's a negative feedback loop built into the physics. We know this, Alexandrov interrupts. But what we didn't account for, Dolezal continues, is how this effect scales with reactor size. In a small core like AM1, the temperature distribution is relatively uniform. But in a large core, 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, regional temperature variations become significant. Hot zones emerge, cold zones emerge, and the reactor naturally redistributes power away from hot regions toward cooler ones, creating a self-balancing system that becomes more stable as size increases, not less. He writes equations. The blackboard fills with symbols. The Americans discovered this accidentally. Their submarine reactors, which operate under extreme conditions, revealed this scaling advantage. That's why Westinghouse is suspending construction, not because the design is flawed, but because they're redesigning for larger cores that exploit this stability. Malyshev leans forward. You're saying your design becomes safer when scaled up? Exactly. The anomalies I observed at AM1 weren't problems. They were indications of this effect beginning to appear even at small scale. At Novovoronezh, with a 210 megawatt core, the stability will be remarkable. We can run at higher temperatures, extract more energy, reduce fuel costs, and, he pauses, knowing this will be decisive, we can standardize the design, build the same reactor 50 times, 100 times, with minimal modification, train operators once, and deploy them anywhere. The silence lasts perhaps 30 seconds. Men look at papers, at each other, at the equations on the blackboard. Someone, Dolezal doesn't see who, says quietly, "This is why the Americans are ahead." Malyshev closes the folder. Comrade Alexandrov, your RBMK design remains under development for specific applications. Military facilities, perhaps. Remote locations where refueling logistics are difficult. This is face-saving language, permission to continue research without committing resources. But for large-scale power generation for the electrification program, we proceed with VVER. Alexandrov's face reveals nothing. He stubs out his cigarette. As the minister decides. The meeting continues for another hour, discussing construction schedules, material allocations, training programs. But the fundamental decision has been made. Dolezal's pressurized water design, the forbidden reactor that senior scientists denounced as ideologically suspect, will become the foundation of Soviet nuclear power generation. What none of them know, what won't become clear for years, is that this decision is based partially on false premises. The American intelligence that suggested Westinghouse was encountering critical failures was accurate in its facts, but wrong in its interpretation. Westinghouse was indeed suspending construction, but not because of design problems. They were retooling for larger, more efficient reactors, exactly as Dolezal concluded. But other intelligence that didn't make it into the folder Malyshev presented, indicated serious concerns about long-term corrosion in pressurized water systems, about fuel assembly degradation, about control rod materials failing after extended irradiation. The CIA, analyzing Soviet reactor development through U-2 reconnaissance photographs and human intelligence sources, watches Novovoronezh's construction with increasing alarm. A May 1957 national intelligence estimate, declassified in 1989, concludes, Soviet pressurized water reactor development has proceeded faster than predicted, suggesting either a breakthrough in materials science or unacceptable safety compromises. Recommend increased technical intelligence collection. What the CIA doesn't understand is that Dolezal isn't making breakthroughs. He's making compromises. The pressure vessels at Novovoronezh use thicker walls than American designs, compensating for inferior steel quality with sheer mass. The control systems are simpler, relying on mechanical interlocks rather than sophisticated electronics. The fuel assemblies are designed for shorter burn-up cycles, accepting higher costs in exchange for reduced stress on materials. It's not elegant engineering, it's pragmatic engineering designed for Soviet industrial reality. The KGB, meanwhile, maintains an entire directorate focused on nuclear espionage. Directorate T, responsible for scientific and technical intelligence, runs dozens of agents inside Western nuclear facilities. Some provide documents, others provide insights, explaining why certain design choices were made, what problems were encountered, how solutions were developed. This intelligence flow is so productive that American counterintelligence officials, reviewing cases decades later, conclude that Soviet reactor development benefited from comprehensive access to Western research outcomes. But espionage cuts both ways. The Americans have sources inside Soviet facilities. One asset, identified in declassified CIA documents only as GT Vanquish, provides detailed information about Dolezal's scaling calculations, about the neutron flux anomalies at AM1, about the debates within the Academy of Sciences. A July 1956 intelligence report stamped Secret No Foreign analyzes this information and concludes, Soviet VVER design incorporates features suggesting fundamental understanding of pressurized water reactor physics comparable to or exceeding U.S. capabilities. Recommend urgent review of naval reactors program security. The resulting security review uncovers nothing. No breaches, no leaks, no compromised personnel. The Americans never consider the possibility that Dolezal simply did the mathematics correctly, that his team solved the same problems independently, that parallel development under competitive pressure can produce similar results without espionage. The assumption that Soviet science is necessarily inferior, necessarily dependent on stolen Western research, blinds analysts to the reality of competent engineering conducted under desperate necessity. In Obninsk, Dolezal returns to work. The AM1 reactor continues operating, generating its modest 5 megawatts, serving as a training facility for the operators who will eventually staff dozens of larger plants. The neutron flux readings remain slightly anomalous, deviating from theoretical predictions in ways that won't be fully understood until computational modeling advances in the 1970s. But the reactor runs safely, and that's sufficient. The photograph that Dolezal keeps on his desk, taken at AM1's inauguration in June 1954, shows a group of engineers standing before the reactor building. They're all wearing suits despite the summer heat. They're all smiling, the slightly forced smiles of men who know photographers are present. Dolezal is in the back row, partially obscured by taller colleagues. His face is sharp, alert, watching something outside the camera's frame. Years later, after his death in 2000, this photograph appears in technical journals and history books, always with the same caption, N.A. Dolezal and team at AM1, world's first nuclear power plant. What the caption never mentions is that the reactor behind them, the machine that made the photograph possible, was considered by many of their colleagues to be an ideological and technical mistake, a dangerous imitation of American design doomed to fail. Dolezal saves that photograph, keeps it visible as a reminder that consensus is not truth, that authority is not correctness, that sometimes survival requires building things that others insist cannot work. Novovoronezh Reactor Unit 1 achieves criticality on September 30th, 1964. The date is not coincidental. Leonid Brezhnev has just consolidated power following Khrushchev's ouster. The new leadership wants technological victories, wants evidence that Soviet science is advancing, wants electricity flowing to prove that central planning works. The reactor, designed for 210 megawatts, reaches full power within 2 weeks, faster than American reactors of comparable size, faster than Soviet planners predicted. But 3 months later, something goes wrong. The incident is not dramatic. No explosions, no radiation releases, no evacuations. On the morning of December 17, 1964, operators at Novovoronezh notice increasing vibration in primary coolant pump 2A. Vibration isn't unusual, pumps shake, it's expected. But the frequency and amplitude are outside normal parameters. The shift supervisor, following procedures Dolezal's team spent years developing, reduces reactor power by 15%. The vibration decreases but doesn't stop. Engineers examine the pump. The bearings, manufactured at a facility in Leningrad, show unexpected wear. Not catastrophic wear, not dangerous wear, but wear that shouldn't occur after only 3 months of operation. Someone orders the bearing removed and sent to Nikiet for analysis. Dolezal's team conducts metallurgical testing. The results are troubling. The bearing material, supposedly high-grade steel, contains impurities inconsistent with specifications. Someone, somewhere in the supply chain, substituted inferior material. This is where the incident transforms from an engineering problem into a political crisis. The Ministry of Medium Machine Building launches an investigation. The investigation reveals that the bearing manufacturer, struggling to meet production quotas, purchased steel from an unapproved supplier. The unapproved supplier, it turns out, is connected to officials in the regional Communist Party apparatus. These officials profit from selling substandard materials to critical industries, knowing that central planning's rigid quota system creates artificial demand, knowing that factory managers desperate to meet targets will accept questionable supplies rather than report shortfalls. The corruption is not unique to nuclear facilities. It's endemic, a survival mechanism in an economy where official procedures are often impossible to follow. But nuclear facilities are different. Substandard materials in a reactor cooling system can kill thousands. The ministry has no choice but to act. Between January and March 1965, 17 people are arrested. 3 are executed, including the factory director who approved the bearing purchase. The regional party secretary responsible for economic oversight disappears from public view. Not arrested, not denounced, simply absent. His fate remains officially unconfirmed, though records released after the Soviet collapse indicate he died in a labor camp in Kolyma. Dolezal watches this unfold with cold understanding. His reactor design works. The engineering is sound. But Soviet industrial culture, the system that must produce thousands of components with consistent quality, is fundamentally incompatible with nuclear safety requirements. He proposes a solution. Nikiet will establish resident inspectors at every facility producing reactor components. These inspectors, answerable only to Dolezal's bureau, will verify quality before materials are shipped. Any deficiencies will result in immediate rejection, regardless of production quotas, regardless of ministry pressure. The proposal generates resistance. Factory managers complain about interference. Regional officials protest about authority being usurped. But Malyshev, still Minister of Medium Machine Building, recognizes necessity. He issues orders establishing the inspection regime, giving Dolezal's engineers unprecedented power to halt production at facilities across the Soviet Union. This decision, made quietly in early 1965, represents a fundamental shift in Soviet industrial practice. For the first time, quality control is formally prioritized over quantity production. For the first time, technical experts are explicitly empowered to override party authority on manufacturing decisions. The policy applies only to nuclear facilities, only to components entering Dolezal's supply chain, but it establishes a precedent. The Americans, monitoring Soviet reactor development, notice the construction pause at Novovoronezh. Satellite imagery shows work slowing, shows what appears to be equipment being removed and replaced. A September 1965 CIA assessment speculates about serious technical problems, possibly a reactor vessel failure, possibly fundamental design flaws manifesting. Soviet pressurized water program may face developmental crisis, the assessment concludes. Recommend continued monitoring for program cancellation indicators. The reality is precisely opposite. The work pause isn't crisis response. It's systematic quality improvement. Dolezal's team is replacing every bearing, every pump, seal, every valve component that can't be verified to specification. They're establishing inspection protocols, testing procedures, failure analysis methodologies. They're building the industrial quality infrastructure that should have existed from the beginning. When Novovoronezh Unit 1 returns to full power in October 1965, it operates flawlessly. The vibrations are gone. The system parameters match theoretical predictions. Operators report that the reactor is boring, stable, predictable, requiring minimal intervention. This is exactly what Dolezal intended. The success enables rapid expansion. Construction begins on Novovoronezh Units 2 and 3, identical to Unit 1. Then on Kola Unit 1, far above the Arctic Circle. Then on Armenian Unit 1 in seismically active terrain requiring special foundation design. By 1970, 12 VVER reactors are operational or under construction. By 1980, that number reaches 53. By 1985, Dolezhal's design, in various evolutionary versions, generates approximately 40% of Soviet electricity. The photograph on Dolezhal's desk remains unchanged. That same image from 1954, same engineers standing before the AM1 building. But now his office walls are covered with new photographs. Reactor cores glowing blue from Cherenkov radiation. Control rooms with operators monitoring instruments. Aerial views of power stations stretching across the Soviet landscape. Each photograph represents a victory over skepticism, over ideological rigidity, over the assumption that Soviet engineering cannot match Western achievement. But the photographs also represent something darker. In 1975, a fire at the Leningrad nuclear plant kills one worker and releases radioactive contamination into the cooling system. The plant uses an RBMK graphite-moderated reactor, the design Alexandrov championed. The incident reveals serious flaws in the RBMK emergency systems, flaws that engineers quietly note in reports that circulate but prompt no fundamental redesign. In 1982, a partial fuel melt at Chernobyl Unit 1, also an RBMK, is contained but suggests that the reactor's positive void coefficient creates dangerous scenarios. Again, reports circulate. Again, no fundamental changes occur. Dolezhal, by this time semi-retired, reads these reports with growing alarm. He submits recommendations to the ministry. Modify RBMK control systems, reduce power density, improve operator training. Some recommendations are implemented. Others disappear into bureaucratic processes. The RBMK design remains operational at 16 facilities across the Soviet Union, generating enormous amounts of power, meeting economic targets, but carrying inherent risks that everyone in the technical community understands. On April 26, 1986, those risks manifest catastrophically at Chernobyl Unit 4. The reactor explodes during a safety test, releasing radiation across Europe, killing dozens immediately and thousands eventually, requiring the evacuation of entire cities. The disaster vindicates everything Dolezhal argued in 1955. The RBMK's positive void coefficient, the characteristic Dolezhal warned made the design inherently dangerous, is the fundamental cause of the runaway reaction that destroyed the reactor. In the aftermath, as the Soviet nuclear program faces international scrutiny and domestic panic, attention focuses on VVER reactors. Are they safe? Can similar accidents occur? Western experts, finally gaining access to detailed Soviet technical documentation, conduct assessments. The conclusions are remarkable. VVER reactors, despite being built with inferior materials and less sophisticated control systems than Western equivalents, are fundamentally sound designs. The negative void coefficient that Dolezhal built into the core geometry provides inherent stability. The containment structures, though less robust than American standards require, are adequate. The control systems, though simpler, are reliable. A 1987 International Atomic Energy Agency report states, Soviet VVER series pressurized water reactors demonstrate design characteristics consistent with international safety standards. While specific components may require upgrades, the fundamental reactor physics provide acceptable safety margins. This assessment, coming from an organization deeply skeptical of Soviet technology after Chernobyl, represents extraordinary validation. Dolezhal, 87 years old, gives a rare interview to a technical journal. Asked about Chernobyl, about whether the disaster could have been prevented, he says simply, I told them in 1955 that graphite reactors were dangerous for power generation. They didn't listen. People died because economics mattered more than physics. The interview was published, then quietly suppressed. Senior officials don't appreciate Dolezhal's bluntness, don't appreciate the implication that political decisions killed people, don't appreciate the reminder that technical expertise was overruled by ideological preferences. But by 1987, the Soviet system is fracturing. Glasnost makes such suppression ineffective. Copies circulate. Engineers read Dolezhal's words and recognize them as truth. The documents that reveal the full story of Dolezhal's forbidden reactor begin emerging in 1991 as the Soviet Union collapses and archives open. Historians and journalists digging through ministry files discover memos, technical reports, meeting transcripts, intelligence assessments, the paper trail of a technological revolution conducted under secrecy and pressure. One particularly significant discovery is a letter dated March 12, 1956, from Dolezhal to Malyshev. The letter, marked Top Secret Special Importance, addresses concerns about scaling VVER designs beyond 300 megawatts. Dolezhal writes, the Americans are building reactors approaching 1,000 megawatts. Our industrial capacity cannot produce pressure vessels of this size with adequate quality. Assurance, I propose instead that we standardize on smaller units, 200 to 300 megawatts, and build multiple reactors at each station. This approach provides redundancy, simplifies manufacturing, and allows incremental capacity addition as demand grows. This letter explains one of the most distinctive characteristics of Soviet nuclear power stations. They typically contain multiple smaller reactors rather than single large units. What Western observers interpreted as inefficiency or technical limitation was actually a deliberate strategy to work within Soviet industrial constraints. Dolezhal understood that Soviet metallurgy couldn't reliably produce the massive pressure vessels American designs required, so he designed around that limitation. The result was power stations that could be built faster, that could begin generating revenue sooner, that could continue operating even if one unit required maintenance or repair. Another significant document, declassified in 1993, is a KGB intelligence report from August 1958. The report summarizes information obtained from sources inside Westinghouse, describing technical challenges with zirconium fuel cladding, unexpected corrosion mechanisms, difficulties with control rod drive mechanisms. The report includes a handwritten note in the margin. Provide to Dolezhal, evaluate relevance to VVER program. This document reveals the extent to which Soviet reactor development benefited from espionage. American researchers, working openly in a competitive commercial environment where companies published technical papers to attract customers, inadvertently provided their Soviet counterparts with warnings about problems to avoid. The Soviets didn't steal complete designs, they stole knowledge about what didn't work, allowing them to bypass years of expensive trial and error development. But perhaps the most revealing documents are Dolezhal's personal notebooks, donated to the Kurchatov Institute archive after his death. These notebooks, covering 40 years of work, contain calculations, sketches, meeting notes, and occasional personal observations. One entry, dated November 20th, 1955, 6 days after the crucial meeting where Malyshev approved VVER development, reads, "They approved the design, but for wrong reasons. They think we're copying American success. They don't understand we're avoiding American mistakes. If they knew how precarious the engineering margins are, how much we're gambling on operator competence and institutional discipline, they would never have agreed." This entry captures Dolezhal's essential predicament. He built reactors that worked, that could be mass-produced, that powered the Soviet Union. But he built them knowing they required a quality control infrastructure that didn't exist, knowing they depended on operator training programs that were inadequately funded, knowing that the same industrial culture that produced substandard bearings would eventually produce substandard reactor components. He gambled that the inspection regime he established would be sufficient, that the institutional mechanisms he created would survive his retirement, that the pressure to meet production quotas wouldn't override safety requirements. For 3 decades, the gamble paid off. VVER reactors operated safely across the Soviet Union. The few incidents that occurred, pump failures, steam generator problems, control system glitches, were contained, analyzed, and used to improve subsequent designs. The catastrophic accident everyone feared never materialized. But Chernobyl revealed the gamble's fundamental fragility. The RBMK reactor that exploded wasn't a VVER, but the disaster demonstrated what happens when institutional discipline fails, when operators override safety systems, when political pressure to complete a test overrides technical judgment. The fact that VVER reactors didn't suffer similar disasters was partly good design and partly good fortune. In 1992, a team of American nuclear engineers visits several VVER facilities as part of post-Soviet cooperation programs. Their trip reports, later published in technical journals, describe contradictory impressions. The reactor designs are sound, fundamentally similar to Western pressurized water reactors. But the facilities themselves show troubling signs: deferred maintenance, inadequate spare parts inventories, operators working with outdated procedures. One engineer writes, "These reactors are like Formula One race cars maintained by mechanics trained on tractors. The machines are capable of extraordinary performance, but the institutional support structure is inadequate for long-term reliability." Dolezhal's career ends in some sense in 1994 when failing health forces his complete retirement from consulting work. He's 95 years old, has survived Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, and the Soviet Union itself. His reactors continue operating in Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Finland, Iran. New VVER units are under construction. His design, the forbidden reactor that senior scientists once denounced, has outlasted the ideological system that initially rejected it. But vindication brings its own burdens. In a 1996 interview, one of the last before his death, Dolezhal is asked whether he's proud of his life's work. He pauses for a long time. "I'm proud we kept the lights on," he finally says. "I'm proud we didn't have a catastrophe with VVER. But I'm haunted by what might have happened if different decisions were made, if better materials were available, if we had more time to develop the technology properly. We built reactors fast because we had to, but had to isn't a good foundation for nuclear engineering." The interviewer asks whether he would have done anything differently. "Everything," Dolezhal says, "and nothing. The constraints were real, the pressure was real, the need was real. We did what was possible with what we had, but possible and safe are not always the same thing." The lasting impact of Dolezhal's work extends far beyond Soviet power generation. His pressurized water reactor design, developed under conditions of technological desperation and ideological suspicion, demonstrated that rapid nuclear deployment was achievable even in nations with limited industrial infrastructure. This lesson was not lost on other countries. In the 1970s, as the oil crisis prompted global interest in nuclear power, developing nations looked to Soviet VVER technology. The reactors were simpler than American designs, required less sophisticated support infrastructure, and came with comprehensive training programs developed from decades of Soviet experience. Finland purchased VVER reactors. India adapted VVER concepts for its indigenous reactor program. China studied Soviet designs before developing its own pressurized water technology. The VVER became the basis for international nuclear proliferation, both in benign and potentially dangerous forms. The photograph on Dolezhal's desk, that 1954 image from AM1's inauguration, takes on new meaning in this context. Those engineers standing before the world's first nuclear power plant weren't just building a reactor. They were establishing a template that would be replicated across continents, that would influence nuclear policy debates for generations, that would shape the global energy landscape in ways none of them could have anticipated. But the photograph also captures a moment of profound vulnerability. Every one of those engineers worked under surveillance. Any technical disagreement could be interpreted as ideological deviation. Any failure could mean arrest, exile, or execution. They built reactors while knowing that success wouldn't necessarily protect them, that the same state apparatus demanding results could destroy them for achieving those results in unapproved ways. This tension between technical necessity and political ideology defined Soviet nuclear development. Dolezhal navigated it by being essential. His reactors worked when others failed, his designs scaled when others couldn't. His engineering was pragmatic enough to accommodate Soviet industrial reality while maintaining adequate safety margins. He made himself indispensable, and indispensability provided a measure of protection that brilliance alone could not. Yet this strategy had costs. In 1968, a young engineer named Vladimir Asmolov joined Dolezhal's team at Nikiet. Asmolov, who would later become one of Russia's leading nuclear safety experts, recalled in a 2005 memoir the culture within Dolezhal's organization. We understood that every calculation might be reviewed by people looking for political rather than technical problems. We learned to write reports that were technically accurate but politically unassailable. We learned to present problems as opportunities for optimization rather than deficiencies requiring correction. We learned to navigate bureaucracy as carefully as we navigated physics. This bureaucratic caution necessary for survival had consequences for safety culture. Engineers focused on making reactors work within political constraints rather than pushing for ideal technical solutions. Problems were minimized in reporting, not because engineers were dishonest, but because highlighting problems could endanger careers, could halt projects, could bring unwanted political attention. The same institutional mechanisms that enabled rapid reactor deployment also suppressed critical information that might have prevented future disasters. The CIA, analyzing Soviet nuclear development throughout the 1960s and 1970s, consistently underestimated the sophistication of VVER technology. Intelligence assessments emphasized Soviet dependence on espionage, highlighted construction quality problems, and predicted that Soviet reactors would suffer increasing failure rates as they aged. A 1973 National Intelligence Estimate concluded, Soviet nuclear power program faces significant technical and industrial challenges that will limit expansion and reliability over the next decade. These predictions proved wrong. Soviet reactor deployment accelerated, reliability improved. By 1980, VVER reactors achieved capacity factors, the percentage of theoretical maximum output actually generated, comparable to American reactors of similar vintage. The CIA's analytical failure stemmed from assumptions about Soviet incompetence that blinded analysts to evidence of genuine capability, but Soviet intelligence made parallel errors about American nuclear development. KGB assessments from the 1970s, declassified by Russian archives in the 2000s, consistently overestimated American reactor reliability and underestimated the economic challenges facing the U.S. nuclear industry. Soviet analysts, working with information from sources inside American utilities and manufacturers, saw technical success but missed the growing political opposition, the escalating regulatory costs, the economic pressures that would eventually halt most U.S. reactor construction. Both sides, in other words, saw what they expected to see. The Americans expected Soviet technology to be inferior and interpreted evidence accordingly. The Soviets expected American capitalism to efficiently deploy superior technology and missed the social and political forces constraining that deployment. Each side's intelligence apparatus, despite access to extensive information, failed to understand the other's nuclear program in its full complexity. This mutual incomprehension had strategic consequences. American defense planners, believing Soviet reactors were unreliable, underestimated Soviet industrial capacity and military sustainability. Soviet planners, believing American reactors were vastly superior, devoted enormous resources to nuclear espionage that might have been better spent on indigenous research. Both sides made policy decisions, based on flawed assessments, creating a hall of mirrors where perception shaped reality as much as reality shaped perception. Dolezal himself seemed aware of this dynamic. In a 1978 lecture at Moscow Engineering Physics Institute, he told students, "The Americans think we stole their reactor designs. Our leadership thinks American designs are superior to ours. Both are wrong. We solved the same problems independently, with different constraints, and arrived at similar but not identical solutions. The Americans have better materials. We have more operational experience. They have more sophisticated control systems. We have simpler, more robust designs. Different doesn't mean inferior." This lecture, recorded and preserved in the Institute's archives, reveals Dolezal's frustration with the ideological lens through which technical achievement was viewed. He built reactors that worked. Whether they were Soviet or American in origin was irrelevant to physics. Neutrons don't care about ideology. Heat transfer doesn't respect political boundaries. Engineering is engineering, regardless of the flag under which it's conducted. But this perspective, self-evident to engineers, was dangerous in a political environment that demanded clear demarcation between Soviet science and Western science, between socialist achievement and capitalist imitation. Dolezal could voice it privately to students, but never in official forums. His public statements always emphasized Soviet innovation, Soviet superiority, Soviet independence from Western influence. The gap between private truth and public necessity was one more constraint he learned to navigate. By the 1980s, as the Soviet economy stagnated and infrastructure aged, the pressures on nuclear power intensified. Electricity demand continued growing. Coal supplies were increasingly expensive to transport. Natural gas, the alternative energy source, was more valuable as an export commodity than as domestic fuel. Nuclear power, despite its costs and risks, remained essential to Soviet industrial survival. This dependency made Chernobyl even more catastrophic. The disaster didn't just kill people and contaminate territory. It shattered confidence in Soviet technological competence, both domestically and internationally. The fact that the exploded reactor was an RBMK, not a VVER, was lost on the general public. Nuclear power became synonymous with danger, with government lies, with callous disregard for human life. Dolezal, watching the disaster unfold, understood that decades of work were being erased by public perception. His reactors, the VVER designs that had operated safely for 30 years, were being condemned by association with Alexandrov's RBMK. In technical circles, experts knew the distinction, but policy is made by politicians responding to public fear, not by engineers analyzing reactor physics. In 1987, facing pressure to shut down nuclear facilities regardless of design type, Dolezal made a decision that surprised his colleagues. He agreed to participate in a televised interview, the first time he'd appeared on Soviet television, to explain the differences between reactor types and to defend VVER safety. The interview, broadcast on the program Vremya, reached tens of millions of viewers. Dolezal, 88 years old and visibly frail, spoke with unexpected force. The reactor that exploded at Chernobyl was a graphite-moderated design with characteristics that many engineers, myself included, warned about for years. The reactors that power most of our cities, the VVER designs, are fundamentally different. They have built-in safety features that make a Chernobyl-type accident physically impossible. Shutting them down would plunge the country into darkness while doing nothing to improve safety. The interview was controversial. Critics accused Dolezal of defending a failed system, of prioritizing economics over lives, of being a mouthpiece for a discredited regime. But it achieved its purpose. The wholesale shutdown of Soviet nuclear facilities didn't occur. VVER reactors continued operating, though with enhanced oversight and safety improvements. Chernobyl led to the abandonment of RBMK reactor construction and eventually to the shutdown of remaining RBMK facilities. But Dolezal's pressurized water designs survived. This survival, however, came with recognition of serious deficiencies. International safety reviews conducted in the 1990s revealed that many Soviet-era VVER reactors lacked adequate containment structures, had outdated control systems, and suffered from deferred maintenance. A massive international program, funded partly by Western governments concerned about another Chernobyl, provided resources to upgrade these facilities. The upgrades cost billions of dollars and took decades to complete, but they transformed Soviet-era reactors into facilities meeting international safety standards. The irony is profound. Dolezal's designs, built in defiance of ideological orthodoxy and technical skepticism, ultimately required Western assistance to achieve their full potential. The engineering was sound, but the institutional support structure, the quality control, the maintenance procedures, the safety culture, had degraded during the Soviet system's final years. The reactor survived the Soviet Union, but only by transforming into something more than Soviet technology. Today, more than 70 years after AM-1 first achieved criticality, Dolezal's VVER design remains operational in multiple countries. Russia continues building new VVER units, incorporating modern digital control systems and passive safety features while maintaining the fundamental core geometry Dolezal developed in the 1950s. China has adapted the VVER concept for its own reactor program. India operates VVER-derived designs. The reactor that Soviet scientists once called forbidden has become one of the most widely deployed nuclear power plant designs in history. In Obninsk, the AM-1 reactor was permanently shut down in 2002 after 48 years of operation. The facility is now a museum, preserved as a monument to early nuclear power development. Visitors can walk through the control room where operators monitored the world's first nuclear power plant, can see the reactor hall where Dolezal's first pressurized water design generated electricity, can examine the instruments and equipment that made it possible. The photograph from 1954, the one Dolezal kept on his desk, hangs in the museum's entrance hall. It's been enlarged and mounted behind glass with a brass plaque identifying the engineers. Most of the names mean nothing to modern visitors. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary work under impossible conditions. They built reactors while the KGB watched them. They calculated core physics while worrying about arrest. They designed safety systems while knowing that admitting problems could be interpreted as political sabotage. Dolezal's name is on the plaque, his face visible in the photograph's back row. Museum guides tell visitors about his achievements: the first nuclear power plant, the VVER reactor design, the role in Soviet industrial development. But they rarely mention the November night in 1955 when he sat in a conference room with 17 men and defended a reactor design that contradicted ideological orthodoxy, that challenged the technical establishment, that risked his career and possibly his life. That moment, not the awards, not the official honors, not the posthumous recognition, was when the future was decided. In that room, tired and scared and uncertain, Dolezal made an argument based on mathematics and physics and the pragmatic understanding that Soviet industry couldn't build what ideologues wanted, but could build what engineering required. He didn't have certainty. He had calculations showing anomalous neutron behavior that might indicate a flaw or might indicate unexpected stability. He had intelligence suggesting American problems that might be fatal or might be growing pains. He had political pressure and technical constraints and the knowledge that millions needed electricity he had to provide. So he drew equations on a blackboard and people believed him and reactors were built. The museum at Obninsk closes at 6 p.m. Guards lock the doors. Lights are extinguished in the exhibition halls. The AM-1 reactor, its fuel removed, its systems deactivated, sits in darkness. But across Russia and Ukraine and Bulgaria and beyond, VVER reactors continue operating. Coolant pumps circulate pressurized water through cores designed according to Dolezal's geometry. Control rods modulate reactivity using principles he established. Steam generators extract heat using configurations he developed. The lights stay on because a man who died in 2000 made correct calculations in 1955. There's a file in the Kurchatov Institute archives, unmarked except for a number, 384755. It contains the original technical drawings for the Novo-Voronezh reactor, hand-drafted on yellowing paper, covered with annotations and corrections. Some of the corrections are in Dolezal's handwriting, his distinctive script squeezing modifications into margins, adding notes about material specifications, changing dimensions by millimeters. The final drawing, dated November 1955, shows a reactor vessel that would be built 43 times across the Soviet Union. Historians and engineers occasionally request access to this file. They photograph the drawings, analyze the calculations, marvel at the elegance of solutions developed without computers, without sophisticated modeling software, without the tools modern designers take for granted. They see in those hand-drafted lines evidence of genius, of determination, of a stubborn refusal to accept that Soviet engineering couldn't match Western achievement. But what they don't see, what the file can't capture, is the courage required to draw those lines. The courage to design reactors that contradicted official preferences, to insist on quality standards that challenged production quotas, to tell powerful men they were wrong. The file shows technical success. It doesn't show the cost of that success, the compromises made, the dangers accepted, the people sacrificed to corruption, purges necessitated by quality control failures. In 2015, on what would have been Dolezal's 116th birthday, a Russian nuclear engineering journal published a special commemorative issue. Articles from prominent engineers praised his technical contributions, analyzed his design innovations, traced his influence on modern reactor development. One article, written by a former Nikiet engineer who worked under Dolezal in the 1970s, concluded, "He gave us light. Whether that light was worth its cost is a question each generation must answer for itself." The question remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. The reactors work, the lights stay on. Millions who never heard Dolezal's name benefit from his engineering. And somewhere in the archives, in files marked top secret that won't be declassified for decades, are documents detailing the compromises, the calculations of acceptable risk, The decisions to build reactors knowing they pushed the boundaries of what Soviet industry could reliably produce. Those documents, when they finally emerge, will complete the story. But the story's essential truth is already visible in that 1954 photograph, in the faces of engineers standing before a reactor they built against skepticism and doubt. They look confident in the photograph, proud of their achievement. They don't look like men who wonder whether history will judge them for what they created, whether the machines they built will ultimately prove humanity's salvation or its downfall, whether giving power to a flawed system was wisdom or folly. They look like engineers who solved a problem. The problem was darkness, the solution was light. Everything else, the politics, the ideology, the competition between superpowers, was noise. In the end, physics doesn't care about politics. Reactors generate power or they don't. The math works or it doesn't. Dolezal's math worked. Whether it should have is someone else's question to answer.